Good evening, and welcome to another in the series of Artists on Artists talks. My name is Lynn Cook, and I organise the program with great assistance from Patrick Heilman in technology, and Kristen Poor in making general arrangements. It's really a pleasure to have Matthew Coolidge talk tonight. He's talking on the Hudson River Landscape School, and it might seem an odd topic in a way, in that when you go to look at Deer's collection in Beacon, you of course don't see works by these 19th century artists. However, we do have a collection of such works, principally watercolours and drawings, which are on long-term loan to Vassar. And this is because Dan Flavin was an avid devotee of this school of artists and made a collection on Deer's behalf in the 80s. In addition, of course, when Deer found the building, the Nabisco building in Beacon, we were of course attracted by the building and the way it offered a very fine structure for the collection. But we were not indifferent to the fact that it was on the Hudson River, and the way that in turn referenced the Hudson River Landscape School of writers and artists, who are the cradle of American culture, you might say. And it's also perhaps a footnote, but not incidental, to say that this weekend we opened a project in conjunction with Scenic Hudson and Minetta Brook, and particularly with the assistance of Diane Shamish, of a project that George Trackus made for us collectively. It's a sculpture that's actually on the bank of the Hudson and provides access to the water for recreational use and leisure and so forth. And so it offers a way again of engaging with those sites that were sites that painters like Thomas Cole and others worked on in the late 19th century. Matthew Coolidge is perhaps known best for his work as the principal founder and director for the Center of Land Use Interpretation. He's been its director since 1994 to the present, and since 2003 he has been on the teaching faculty of Columbia College of the Arts Curatorial Studies program in San Francisco. He was educated at Boston University, where he took a Bachelor of Arts with an emphasis on environmental studies, contemporary art and film studies in 1991, and in 2004 was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. I'll read you a statement about the Center for Land Use Interpretation because it's an extraordinary and unique enterprise. And it will help give you a context from which Matthew is speaking tonight. The Center for Land Use Interpretation, Matthew writes, has been the principal endeavor of my career since its founding in 1994. The Center is an educational organization that produces exhibits, tours, publications, and other public programming and resources related to the constructed landscape of the United States. The Center's programs have been exhibited at museums, universities, interpretive centers, and other non-commercial exhibit spaces and locations across the nation. They have many activities on the West Coast, but more recently you have set, I believe, a center in Troy, further upstate, and my experience, my most memorable experience perhaps with Matthew, was going to see sun tunnels with him and Nancy Holt some years ago, and then driving to Wendover, which is also another location where artists' residencies and activities have taken place. And all of these in different ways speak to, critique and engage landscape traditions in this country, both photographic and artistic and literary traditions. And I would urge you to look into their activities. In my reading of their activities, one of their principal mentors must be Robert Smithson. And so I think there's a way in which looking at some of the works at India's collection, again, connect in different ways to Matthew's activities. And so please join me, and would also like to thank our patrons for this series, Artis on Arcus, who are here to welcome Matthew. All of us, please give him a big hand.
Thank you very much, Lynn and Kristen and others at DF for inviting me here to talk about something that I've been literally immersed in a bit over the past couple of years, the Hudson River. We do have an office in Troy, New York, another beacon away from Manhattan, where we do projects about the northeastern United States. Troy is centrally located in the Northeast. It's as far from Fort Kent, Maine, as it is from Pittsburgh. So it's kind of in the middle. And that's one reason why we're there. I normally talk about the center and talk about the sort of projects that we do, and it ends up being a kind of immersive odyssey of exploration into different aspects of the landscape in the United States, but today we'll be focused on the Hudson and in a more subjective kind of view of this amazing landscape or waterscape, though the water itself isn't the interesting part, obviously. The land use goes on the shores. The water is a kind of a negative space, you might say. And it's great to do it here at DIA because of DIA's association with the Hudson, with DIA Beacon, obviously, and the collection of drawings they have, and also, of course, their interest in land art and great tradition of landscape, in creative landscapes of all kinds. If we could dim the lights, I'll get into the imagery, which is always a big part of what we do. I'm going to skip the kind of description about the organization. Lynn did a good job of summing it up. We do focus on the United States in general, and everything we do in a way is about America with kind of a capital A, in a sense. We look at the landscape as a reflection of culture, of the sort of collective American culture and society and economy. The Hudson River is arguably the point of origin for this kind of American art as we know it today. In a way, it's sort of where America's art, again, capital A, came from. The river, because of its sort of bucolic qualities, its proximity to this growing city, and its country houses and estates that developed by the barons of industry and the growing America being developed along its shores. It was a place where a lot of America kind of came together. The originators of sort of the commerce of art here in New York City have a lot of their origins in the Hudson River School, starting in the 1830s, 1840s. The Hudson School kind of peaked in the 1870s, 1860s perhaps, and began waning to some degree by the turn of the century. Other things had sort of progressed. But I'm going to talk kind of just to provide a context for the Hudson as a kind of an aesthetic space by looking at the Hudson School, which is something that we do kind of take for granted in a way. I know when I had never really kind of considered all the characters as much until I began to try to put this talk together. But the individual characters are compelling, of course, but there is this sort of this central collection of Hudson River School that is the kind of most important part of them. This sort of, even though they never really, that was a label applied to them, and at least the early proponents of it, rather than something that they really saw themselves as. And of course, they didn't just look at the Hudson, they looked at the whole country, in fact, the whole world. But that lens that they kind of, that perspectival point of view, even though they applied their trade all over the world, that kind of focal optical instrument almost was this sort of aesthetic POV that was grown in the Hudson River. And the people who converged, of course, the sort of captains of industry, developing their estates upriver, providing a kind of a seat for the resources to develop the school and a kind of an art market. Some of the the biggest players, the most sort of well-known artists in America at the time were Hudson River Schools, and they were promoted quite highly by a fairly small group of. Granted, there weren't so many art galleries in New York in 1830, but still, there were. It was very much a kind of a small collection of people developing and promoting this artwork. But I'm not so much going to talk about the theory and the background. My job usually is to be a kind of a tour guide, so I'm going to really kind of work in that role. But I'll begin by the background of Hudson School, Thomas Cole. It sort of started with him, very much started with him. He was born in 1801, English guy, came over with his family and settled in Ohio. They were not very well off. They did sort of crafts trades and things and made wallpaper patterns. And Thomas Cole, as a teenager, even kind of hit the road, eventually started doing portraits for people along the way, and made his way to Pennsylvania, where he stumbled on really the first kind of American landscape artist who isn't very well known, but is still a important character in that he kind of inspired Cole. And this was Thomas Doty, and people kind of refer to him now slightly pejoratively because his trees always kind of look the same, and they weren't really very accurate to what American trees look like. But they inspired Thomas Cole quite considerably, and he found his way from Philadelphia, where these paintings were on display, to the New York City. He joined his family, who was here then, and began sort of asserting his idea of sort of being a depictor of the American landscape. He took a steamship up the Hudson in 1825, which was the year the Erie Canal opened, so there was a lot of attention on the Hudson, a lot of excitement. The Erie Canal representing this bridge between the sort of the back country, the outback, and the urban area of Manhattan, and crops and goods came through the canal. There was that was sort of the excuse, but he went up to kind of depict the landscape of as he found it, not knowing really what to expect in a sense. The paintings that he made on this first trip, he wandered around through the woods on his own, making lots of sketches, and that's another Doty image. He came out of the Catskill Creek and the what Catskill Creek, they call it generally today, with a few paintings which were on display in New York City. They were noticed by Colonel John Trumbull, who was president of the American Academy of Fine Arts here in New York City. And that's really what set off the career. This painting in particular that was in the window of a shop this is from 1926. So Cole was, in the Romantic tradition that was already established. The people, the English Romantics, of course, people like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron. But he looked, but where he was unique, he was looking at America and looking at American landscape as a kind of an Eden, as an unvanquished country, a new country. The sense of optimism looking west across the Hudson into the sunset was as looking at this land that had not really been touched. So perhaps, as a Christian too, and of course they were all Christians in different degrees, but Cole was a practicing Christian, though not as devout as some of the others. He did look at the landscape of the West as of America as a perhaps an opportunity to reverse the original sin. I don't know, but there was great optimism in this symbolic landscape and what it represented as a spiritual kind of purity. Cole ended up moving to Catskill. He became known as the Catskill Hermit amongst some people. He was there for 20-some years, or slightly less actually. He moved there in the early 30s permanently and died in 1848. He had lots of fans and friends, including Asher Durand, who was much more famous for his engravings, but when Cole died, Asher, who had by then become much more of a landscape painter because of Cole more than anything else, Asher Durand painted this depiction of Thomas Cole right after he died. This is a painting, Kindred Spirits, which shows Cole with the easel in the hat, or the paintbrush in the hat, and William Cullen Bryant standing next to him, who was very well known in those days as a writer and a kind of politically connected writer, a publisher, and somebody who had great influence in sort of writing about the American landscape and this kind of pastoralism and romantic kind of appreciation of it. So Cole is here kind of literally, I don't know how well you can see it, but this is in the Catskill Creek area, kind of a hybridized landscape, but the clove, as they call it, is actually a physical place in the kind of the canyon of the Catskill Creek. He's saying to Bryant, kind of like, well, hey, look at this, this is what we need to tell people about and show it. This painting, incidentally, is headed into Crystal Bridges. So it was bought by the heiress of Walmart, which apparently she paid $35 million for it, a very high price, but it indicates the sort of level of regard that painting has in American kind of mythology. The Crystal Bridges Museum, designed by Moshe Safdie. This is a model. It's under construction. It will be open probably 2009, right near Bentonville, incidentally, which is where Walmart was founded. This was the Five and Dime, which started the whole empire. Frederick Church is the next sort of major character in the Hudson School, and he's probably better known than Cole, and he was made a lot more money as well as an artist. He came from a pretty privileged background in Hartford, Connecticut, and he saw paintings in Daniel Wadsworth's home, and then in the Athenaeum that became the Wadsworth's collection of paintings. And it was, in fact, Wadsworth who asked Thomas Cole if young Frederick Church could be a student, which Cole had never taken a student before, but said okay. And so at 18 years old, Frederick Church went to live with Cole in Catskill from 1944 to 1946. The two of them apparently had a pretty good time together, traipsing through the woods and doing all kinds of work. The Church is best known, this was sort of his breakthrough painting, 1957, Niagara Falls. Falls were very, very popular thing to depict. he went on a trip to South America a number of times, then partially inspired by the writings of Alexander von Humboldt. The Heart of the Andes was really his most well-known piece, that really kind of made him into an art star. This was 1859. It was shown here in New York City, 25 cents per look, which is about $5 today. It generated about $600 a day for him and his gallerist, and it was eventually sold for $10,000, which was obviously a huge amount of money at the time. But you have to understand that this was before photography really had become the thing. So I mean, this was like Jerry Bruckheimer of the way of conveying a kind of drama of a place. We go to the movies now, but anyhow, so it's a static frame perhaps of a movie. You imagine all the minute features and movement and detail. Pretty dramatic piece, but making $600 a day, definitely word got out that this was a lucrative activity to be a landscape painter, and people started heading out all over the place in America to capture, make movies. The Hudson School. This is Morning on the Hudson, Haverstraw Bay by Sanford Gifford, who was a friend of Church's and also a fellow founder of the Metropolitan Museum here in New York City. He was from Hudson, New York, but he mostly worked in New York City. This is John Frederick Kensett, this is Eaton's Neck. It's a Long Island Sound image, but from the neighborhood. He was from Connecticut, and he painted the Sound more than anything. And he also traveled with Asher Durand to Europe and other places. Albert Bierstadt, this is the Yosemite Valley. He came from the Dusseldorf School, which brought a lot of sort of romantic painters, but he became known for depicting Western landmarks, especially the parks, or what became parks later on. Later on, it's kind of interesting that Dusseldorf has been such a major factor on American arts, and it reminds me again, how the sort of the serialism of the Beckers and other artist pair that is collected here at the DIA, and they also had a great influence on subsequent generations of landscape portraiture. Bierstadt ultimately built a mansion on the Hudson, like a lot of the painters did. It was right next to Washington Irving's house, but it later burned to the ground with a lot of his paintings in it. Thomas Moran, Yellowstone, maybe more even than Bierstadt. He's associated with this sort of the parks and the monuments of American West, and helping to kind of lobby to get them sort of appreciated and preserved. So the Ansel Adams of the Hudson School, like the other Hudson School painters, though he was all over the place too. They often traveled to the White Mountains in New Hampshire and Scottish castles, the Rhineland. All these kind of tropes began appearing. Icebergs, volcanoes, kind of big things, grand things. But generally, of course, natural things. That was what they were depicting for the most part, and not people directly. Samuel Coleman, Storm King on the Hudson. Here we begin to see some smokestacks and some changes in the landscape. These is, steamers. But the Hudson was generally depicted as a wild space. There were industries for sure in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, up and down the Hudson, but these weren't generally factored in. The wild nature is what they were interested in. Today, the romantic view of the river still exists for sure, though some of us, this view represents a much more kind of complicated version of romanticism, one that has rebounded off the west coast, and driven by manifest destiny, bouncing back, washing over the American land. A century after the Hudson School ended, roughly today, this is a much more complicated kind of romanticism. It's compounded by, I'm going to read this for some reason. I have to read this little quote here, even though I wrote it. It's a view compounded by the mounds of interceding history, the evolution of environmentalism, which some say began here. The perspectival layers of the legions of interest groups that have piled up on this physical and political shore, and the multiplicity of interpretive vectors and points of view that bounce around the valley like a hyperactive spatio-historical laser light show. So there you go. This is Boscobel, which is one of these kind of point of views of the contemporary Hudson, overlooking one of the more dramatic parts of the river with West Point in the background. Boscobel, incidentally, was moved to that location from somewhere else. But we'll begin a kind of a journey up the river, echoing perhaps, in a sense, Cole's steamboat ride of 1824. The point of embarkation for us, though, is going to be the Battery Park, and it's where most of New York City kind of experiences the water, the river. This is also the first defensive position on the Hudson River. You see the Castle Clinton there. It's the old pier, which I guess will someday be in kind of a visitor center for loading on the boats. Inside the castle is this interpretive display about the evolution of that portion of Manhattan. It's interesting to see this and sort of think of the previous aerial image. You can see how the shorelines filled in around the castle, which used to project out into the river. Certainly anybody traveling, we're not going to travel by boat, incidentally. It'll take too long. At the Circle Line, which does go around and around Manhattan and occasionally sort of trajectory on up to Bear Mountain, to the park. We're going to move a little more quickly in one of these helicopter. The first thing you notice, and if you're thinking about 150 years ago, some of the changes, this sort of landfilling. I mean, the city has become a kind of three-dimensional architecture. It's almost like the ground is an arbitrary, common level. It extends above and below. It's almost like it's one big mass of constructed space. Obviously, the landfilling that's gone on has defined the shoreline and kind of continues to, but Battery Park City is an interesting example of how that sort of landfilling takes place. When the World Trade Center was constructed, a lot of the waste material from the excavation to build the foundation went into extending the shoreline and became the foundation, the sort of plane, the ground plane for Battery Park City. And now, of course, you can see the hall behind it where the World Trade Center used to be. Now it's home to, Merrill Lynch and Amex and all these other sort of high finance companies. And as you follow the shoreline, you see these piers that have been converted into recreational use. Obviously, the maritime activity, which, in the turn of the century, 1900, it was a very, very busy waterfront, a very sort of wild place. Now it's been kind of what piers remain are almost entirely recreational. These kind of extensions of horizontality in a very kind of vertical place. There's a couple of pieces of old stuff that have been left. This is the only remaining sort of Lightner Pier. The piers that were at a sort of an angle to the shore so that the trains could kind of get out there without having to curve all the way into the city. And there used to be a whole row. And when Trump City was established, they took out a lot of them, but left this one as a remnant, kind of a ruin. This is Pier D, which is separate from the shore. So it's the other ones were being vandalized and graffitied, and so they took the ones that touched the shore away. On the other side of the river, semi kind of a Gothic is Gotham, which is a sort of a Hudson River School term. I think it was Washington Irving, maybe. But anyhow, this kind of new city is growing on the leftover remnants of industry along the New Jersey shore. They have a few relics of their own. So between Pepsi on the East River and Colgate, we're well sort of bookended here with some of the commercial remnants. This fantastic old railroad station, this French chateau, which was the kind of portal into New York City from points west. The country used to kind of converge in these few terminals on the New Jersey shore and transition into ferries and vice versa, but now it's totally sort of disconnected. The tracks are gone. It's just a big relic part of the park there, Liberty Park. And moving up the New Jersey shore, which was just massive amounts of industry not very long ago. Everything is getting kind of redeveloped and recontoured. A few remaining Superfund sites with their containment booms sort of draped almost like bunting between these piers of redevelopment. One of the biggest master plan redevelopment projects in the United States, 2 miles long, basically, from 34th Street, across the river on Manhattan to 95th Street, is all being developed by, at once over the coming years, and has been for a few years by companies like the Roseland Corporation. Port Imperial being a series of kind of developments, each with a different sort of theme, different lifestyle, amenities associated with each theme, development, things like, this mall, Target, mini golf. I believe this is the old Ford plant that got paved over. And back to the Manhattan side, recreation on top of this billion-dollar wastewater treatment machine, the North River Pollution Control Plant, which was built in the mid-'80s. Prior to this, incidentally, all of the West Side sewage went untreated into the Hudson. This took a long time to develop and was sort of pushed further and further up Manhattan. Nobody wanted this in their backyard, and it settled up there. And it has this kind of a parkland on top of it, but there's like 2,500 piers that are driven into the bedrock that support it. Fairly large thing, about 30 acres of artificial land mass. Ross Dock on the New Jersey side, as the Palisades begin to pile up. Former kind of quarry landing that was developed into a private campground and then is now a public park. And as you get to the tip of Manhattan, where it used to be, all about trains, you can soar off the island, thanks to Robert Moses. But this is where the train converges, the tracks coming along on the north side that ultimately, starting at this point, follow the east shore of the river all the way up to Albany, being one of the main features of the shoreline from this point on. One of the last hulks of industry in the lower Hudson, and maybe even the grandest in the entire river now, is the Glenwood electrical station in Yonkers, which is being redeveloped eventually, but it's totally abandoned at the moment. This is a current plan for it. I believe the architect, William Alsop, has recently proposed this. They just announced it last week, I think, so they take off most of the roof of the plant and do that, whatever that is. I'm not entirely sure. Well, right behind the plant, incidentally, is the Hudson River Museum. There is a museum of the Hudson River. There's the Hudson River Maritime Museum in Kingston, but this is the Hudson River, and it's has some great features in it. Primarily the Hudson River Rama, which is they call it the largest sort of scaled map of the Hudson, most detailed one, largest one. It's located in the Hudson River Rama area of the museum, and describes different aspects of the river. And then there's this old scroll that in the museum as well, which from the 1845, 1847, and it shows each of the shores drawn in great detail, and you can kind of scroll this back and forth to kind of travel up river, which is sort of what we're doing now. Continuing on, this is Anaconda's Hastings on Hudson's plant. So it's now being redeveloped, like a lot of the industrial sites. It's got a ways to go still. This was a major Superfund cleanup, but it also has an interesting connection to the West. If we're talking about the Hudson School, depicting a kind of a pastoral, perfect, untouched, Edenic space. This plant processed copper that came from the company's pit in Butte, Montana, as well as a few other places. Butte, Montana is one of the most physically transformed non-urban landscapes in the country, and is also claims to have the longest Superfund site in America, which is the stream that sort of flows out of Butte, over 120 miles long. And then the Hudson River, of course, claims to have the longest Superfund site in America as well. The sediments of PCB contaminated sediments from the GE plant up north. So you have these kind of dueling Superfund layers of east and west in the Hudson. This is getting redeveloped into probably, whatever, we'll see. But it's got a spectacular location on the river. The Palisades, this is kind of the state line where New Jersey stops. The Palisades were mined, they were quarried. It is a natural kind of colonnade, but in the 1800s, it was quite substantially blasted, with the rock being collected for construction material from the base. And it was the destruction of the view that people like Rockefeller had across the river that led to the establishment of the Palisades Interstate Park System in 1900, which was one of the early sort of preservationist entities. He ended up buying a lot of the Palisades and sort of giving it over to this commission to run it, to save it from its despoliation. One of the results of that, though, was that the kind of quarrying moved upriver and changed forms. This is Piermont in Haverstraw, or in the Tappan Zee area, actually, and it's pier with a mont next to it, and it was another extension of this sort of transcontinental railway, sort of projecting almost like it had a whole lot of inertia and momentum, and it went another mile or so across out into the river to basically get deep water where they could then have the ferries come out. And now it's just a relic, but is a basis for condominium and townhomes at one end. The Mont half of Piermont is a mountain just out of sight on the left, which was another defense site as well. It was actually a Nike missile launch point for the network of Nikes that surrounded the urban area of New York City. This just north on the other side of the river, this is the old General Motors plant at North Tarrytown. Back in 1900, again, everything sort of fell, it seems, in 1900 squarely. The first kind of production was developed here. They made steam-powered cars. General Motors took over the site, and they didn't make steam-powered cars. They made Pontiacs and Oldsmobiles there until the 1990s, and the plant was torn down in 1998 and is now being redeveloped into Lighthouse Landing, which is a mixed-use master plan community. Roseland Properties is actually doing much of the project here as well. And in keeping with the way that the sort of industrial town is becoming a kind of a bedroom community, North Tarrytown changed its name officially after the plant closed, or perhaps even a little before the plant closed, into Sleepy Hollow, which gives a physical place to a mythological place in Washington Irving's romantic novels. He lived in the general area. Sing Sing was there when coal went up the river, but it wasn't quite as big as this. Now it has about 2,500 inmates, but it's, I guess, was a fairly new place at that time. Being sent upriver was a term that one could associate and probably originated here, sort of the negative connotation of being going upriver. The death house here, incidentally, New York State's death house, killed 613 people over the years. It's since the death penalty was abolished in 1971. Nothing has happened. The death house is now used as a vocational training space. You can see one of the old parts of the prison without a roof on it, in the middle of the complex there. This projection it's mostly natural peninsula, but it's been beefed up considerably. It was a dump for many, many years. Teller's Point, which sticks out from Croton-on-Hudson, and it's you can see where the landfill is, kind of in the middle, where most of it is. It was quite typical for the garbage to find its way not just to the Meadowlands, where all except for 2 hills in the Meadowlands are garbage mounds, but it also went upriver to places along the shore. Haverstraw Quarry on the other side of Haverstraw Bay is one of numerous kind of trap rock quarries that are basically sort of limestone for cement production. This one is unique in that it's maintained its contour so that the view from the east side of the river is unaffected. But it's a reminder that the kind of negative space for the kind of bar chart of Manhattan has to be somewhere. For every pit, there's a pile. For every pile, there's a pit. just like Haverstraw Bay, the area around Haverstraw itself was one of the biggest brick production areas in America. In fact, definitely the biggest for a while. And the pits are still kind of scattered around this sort of artificial marshland, much of which has been filled in for development. And this is a gypsum plant on a kind of a peninsulandic island right off town. And this is one of a few gypsum plants in the area, but this is U.S. gypsum. They invented wallboard, the kind of drywall, and that's what they make here. They get their raw material from Nova Scotia for some reason, but I guess it's an indication that the fluid, the water, is still a place of commerce and for bulk materials. Most of the traffic up and down the Hudson today, though, is gasoline going to Albany and other places on barges. The power plants around the bay, Haverstraw Bay, and at other points up the Hudson, there's about 10 or so. This is by far the biggest, Indian Point. The nuclear plant with the dual reactor is about 2,000 megawatts, almost a quarter of the power for New York City, famous for all kinds of things, including being flown over by the 9/11 terrorists, but a center for controversy about the safety of such things. Iona Island, remarkable landscape painted by the Hudson River School a few times, but it was used from 1900 to the 60s by the Navy as an ammunition storage site, and many of the buildings were removed. Some of them remain, but you can see the kind of patterns of where the buildings were. It's still closed to the public, but not for military reasons, more for habitat for the bald eagle, which is a civilian creature, I believe. Dick's Castle stands out from the landscape on the east side of the river at Garrison. It's a dramatic, kind of Moorish building. It may be completed by now, I'm not sure. It's been under construction for so long. It's had so many different sort of stages. It's named Dick's Castle because it was Evans Dick who built it, or started building it. And it was owned by Dia for a number of years, and maybe Lynn can tell us how many. I don't know for sure, but originally the Hudson School paintings and drawings that Dan Flavin collected were going to be installed in this building as a museum, an institute of the Hudson River. I believe it was actually called, it went through a few different names. The Institute for the Hudson Highlands was going to be established there. This is one of the drawings in the collection. Coastal View, James David Smillie, 1881. This is one of 83 pieces in this collection that Dan Flavin collected through the 70s and I guess early 80s, but mostly it was the Lone Star Foundation, which merged with the in 1980, which collected them. The castle is still privately owned now, and it's like I say, I'm not sure if it's completely finished or not, but Dan Flavin's institute, it went from being called the Institute for the Hudson Highlands to the Dan Flavin Art Institute, which ultimately opened in Bridgehampton, in New York. But he lived here originally in Garrison, and that idea transferred over to Bridgehampton, which opened in 1983. It's still open and managed by Dia there. This is another image in the collection, John Kensett, Catskill Mountain, 1849. It's kind of interesting. I mean, if Dan Flavin lived in Garrison and obviously loved the Hudson, you can see why he was interested in these, but as an artist who works with light, appreciating the Hudson School makes a lot of sense as well, but they collected these drawings, these sketches, these charcoals, which I don't know if any of them in the collection have color. There might be one or two, but for the most part, they're these kind of ephemeral drawings, these studies, all with notes, graphic notes taken by the Hudson School painters when they were in the field. They didn't tend to do plein air painting, at least in the early on, because the paints were cumbersome, had to be mixed in the studio. So they would take notes in the field and then come back and paint. Here's another one, Cornwall, Hudson River, 1861, David Johnson. Many of them even had notes written on them in script. There's one that I don't have an image of, but is on view at Vassar College, where the note says, "Lovely golden meadow, sun coming out of warm luminous clouds, melting warm light in distances, grassy, weedy foreground, goldenrod dark against the sky, Maine." And then the paint, it kind of, it's black and white drawing. Maybe they would have had cameras, they'd take pictures instead, I don't know. But this is one of the more completed parts of Dick's Castle. This is a castle painted by Cropsey in 1847, a castle in Scotland, also in the collection of Dia. Another connection for Dick's Castle and the collection of images certainly would have made a certain sense. Here's another castle image in the collection. John Kensett, 1845. This is in a Rhineland castle. But it reminds me especially of West Point, which is directly across from Dick's Castle, which is this kind of Gothic landscape, a very kind of castle-like space, which also was there to some degree when coal went up the river. It was established by Thomas Jefferson as a school in 1802. George Washington called this point on the river the most important strategic position in America at that time, obviously. And while the Army focused more on engineering and civil works in the early years, and now it's mostly military, kind of basic training and officer training, it still is a huge and perhaps the most important school in the Army. It's also part of the gold and silver bullion repository for the nation, has a U.S. Mint location, and is off the deepest point of the Hudson, 202 feet deep, just off the peninsula there, a place that's called World's End. Storm King Mountain, as you go up into the Hudson Highlands, the most dramatic part of even the landscape itself feels kind of Gothic at this point. The river, the roadway at about 200 feet up, cut right into the edge with some overlooks. The mountain itself was the site of a great controversy, as some of you may recall, in the 60s when Con Edison wanted to build a big power plant, what they call a pumped storage plant. The water would be pumped up to a holding area and then drop back down, turning turbines. This was a project that would physically alter the mountain quite dramatically and was a real kind of focal point for people who had interest in the Hudson. People who lived there, environmentalists, got together to stop the project, which they did successfully. It was about an 18-year battle. And by the time it ended, the environmental consortiums of the river were fairly well organized. And some would argue that this is sort of where the modern environmental movement really kind of got going. Things like Scenic Hudson, which emerged because of this and formed as an organization to oppose the Storm King plant, is still a major player in shaping the shores along the river today, and lack of shaping of the shores as well. Storm King is, people think of the sculpture park, but Storm King sculpture park is on the other side of the mountains. Actually, it's on another river, the New York Thruway, but it's still in that sort of pastoral, Storm King-esque landscape. One of the great monuments of Romanticism on the river is Polopel Island, Bannerman's Island. You might see this from the train. You can see the tracks right there. Great view. This was a romantic Scottish castle built by a romantic Scotsman who was also the founder of America's Army-Navy industry, the surplus Army-Navy industry. Bannerman bought just about everything left over from the Spanish-American War and created a massive kind of inventory of stuff that was sold off to the public over the years. He built this place to house his collection and his inventory because he was a salesman, but it became a kind of a personal arsenal of a large magnitude, and he would he lived there on and off for a while. It was finished in 1910. He died, after which it was sold to the state in 1967. Then it was burned by accident in 69, and now it's, we'll just kind of, we're in a helicopter, remember, so we'll kind of fly around it, get a few sense of the view of this place. It's almost as if, and I haven't found a direct connection to Hudson School image, but it's as if it's a manifestation of that kind of romantic Hudson sense. It's not open to the public yet. They are trying to stabilize it so pieces don't fall on your head when you're there. One day it might open to the public. Fantastic collection of ruins at Denning Point, which is right near Beacon, which are being converted now into the Beacon Institute for Rivers and Estuaries, part of a kind of resurgence of activity in the Beacon area. Some of the great mill ruins on the Hudson are just up Fishkill Creek as well, nearby. Dia Beacon being in what could have been a ruined mill building maybe, but it was in pretty good shape relatively when they got it. Discovered, by Michael Govan flying up the Hudson, and perhaps after Dick's Castle was out of the picture, looking for a replacement, kind of like the way Michael Heiser and James Turrell find their places by flying. Beacon Landing, which Lynn mentioned, George Trachas's project. This was an old fuel depot and ferry landing right on the edge of town near Dia Beacon. That's now being developed largely because of Scenic Hudson's involvement in stopping a kind of proposed condo development at the site. They're building a kind of a eco-friendly hotel and recreational area, and George Trachas is building, and I guess it's opening right next week, this peninsula, this kind of sculpted form on a portion of the old landing, where incidentally pieces of the old bridge across the Hudson, the Newburgh Beacon Bridge, when they resurfaced it, they dumped the old asphalt and at Beacon Landing, where it's sort of still visible a little bit, or was a few years ago. Across the river, Newburgh, poor old Newburgh, which is one of the most kind of flushed out cities of the Hudson. A lot of the historic buildings were torn down. Urban renewal had a huge impact, and the waterfront is now being sort of recaptured by developers, for sort of recreation. They've kind of painted holes in the train trestle going through, cutting off the waterfront from the town, and then some of the more scenic, pastoral parts of the Newburgh shorefront are actually Superfund sites from different eras of scrap metal industries and things. Up the river from Newburgh, more power plants and infrastructure and pipelines. Pipelines converge and cross the Hudson in different places, natural gas and other things, including water. This is the Eastern Shore pumping station for the Delaware River Aqueduct, one of 3 major water supply infrastructures for the city of New York. This is the most recently constructed one and the one that extends furthest out, all the way capturing water in the Delaware River watershed, way out in sort of central New York. But the 15-foot conduit snakes over hill and over dale, goes underneath the river about 600 feet below the river's surface at this point, part of an 82-mile-long continuous pipe that then continues in other forms up to the reservoir and down to the city. Different pits which have created negative kind of images of the hills that were once there. This is another trap rock quarry at Hampton Point, Peg's Point, a big sand pit, which has been flattened to become a car auction site for scrapped cars. Clinton Point Quarry south of Poughkeepsie, a great view from the train which goes right along the narrow line of shore. This is the largest excavation currently underway on the Hudson, run by Tilcon, which operates most of the major excavations on the river. IBM, Poughkeepsie, while no direct connection to the shoreline really is still a big physical presence. This is one of 2 kind of campuses, the other in Fishkill. Between the 2, they still employ around 10,000 people. Of course, the Vanderbilt mansion in Hyde Park, Roosevelt's estate nearby, McKim, Mead and White, staff of 60, used just a few weeks of the year, one of several houses they had. But the mansions along the Hudson are dramatic and legion, the sculpted grounds being the proving ground for Calvert Vaux and Olmsted. Mills Mansion, known as Stassburg, north of Hyde Park. Another McKim, Mead and White, built for Ogden Mills and his wife Ruth Livingston Mills. The Livingstons, of course, being the famous 18th century family that had lots and lots and lots of acreage up there and had a relative in every one of these mansions, practically, of the dozen or so that are there. Ogden Mills made his fortune, or his father did actually, in the West. Went west in the gold rush and ended up founding the Bank of California and other financial entities, and came back to New York, and his son built the mansion, which is owned by the state. Unlike Hyde Park, which is owned by, the Vanderbilt mansion was owned by the federal government, this one's owned by the state, and they don't quite have the resources to make it perfect. And in fact, it was the whole exterior was sprayed with gunite in the 50s to try and stabilize the facade, and has never really recovered. But the grounds are there, and they get used by groups that kind of rent it out. And the day after this image was taken, it was covered in vintage cars. You see these kind of tents all over these mansions of the Hudson, temporary function tents. This is another mansion on the other side at Esopus, by another kind of baron, the Payne estate. Oliver Hazard Payne, tobacco, steel, oil. Rockefeller bought out his Cleveland oil business. He built this mansion and then collected the estate by 1909. designed by Carrere and Hastings, who made the New York Public Library and the Frick mansion as well. And now it's occupied by Marists, who moved in the 40s. The inheritor, a nephew of Payne, didn't use the building much. It was one of several that they had in Newport and Florida and other places. So by 1936, it was given over to Episcopalian kind of missionaries who turned into a convalescent hospital. And then 10 years or so later, the Marists bought it. They have Marist College on the other side of the river, and it's used as a seminary. And he used to park his 300-foot-long yacht at the bottom of the hill there. That area is full of sort of seminaries and retreat centers for different religious organizations that have built some of the most dramatic structures out there, and also taken over the mansions. In many cases, about a dozen or so different orders. This is the Mount St. Alphonsus Seminary, which is no longer a seminary. They don't have so many people who are training to be Redemptorist Catholics, but so it's now just kind of a retreat center, still run by the Redemptorists, but any religious organization really can use it, as a sort of a conference center and retreat center. Holy Cross Monastery, which actually does still have some monks in it nearby. And then in Sopus also is the Dino Nobel explosives plant, which is in the background. Sopus Lake with its townhomes, and then the sheds in the middle ground are Iron Mountain Storage, the largest record storage company in America, which has a number of sheds there. One of the great lands, untamed post-industrial landscapes just north of Kingston, where the entire shoreline for a while is brick from an old brick plant, but the majority of the old cement plant is kind of wild and overgrown in some areas, and then just wild in others. It's a place where the ground has been dug up and mounded and cut in all kinds of dramatic ways, and the landscape folds and unfolds. It's a place where people can go and, burn cars and shoot televisions and ride dirt bikes and all those great things you can't do in your own backyard. There's incidental lakes. And it's right on the Hudson shore. Different parts of it disintegrate into the river, and this is a tunnel aperture which goes deep into the ground. Not too far away, on the other end of the spectrum, this is the Edgewater mansion. I forgot to mention that Kingston is all being turned into condominiums soon. That big proposal to redevelop that entire site into housing development. This is Edgewater in Barrytown, which is a spectacular, though not absolutely huge like some of the others, romantic mansion. The original building dates all the way back to 1829. Mary Livingston lived in it, and when they built the railroad on the east side of the river, she was so upset that she moved to London, swearing never to return. About 1850, the train goes right by the back of the house, cutting it off from the rest of the land, just kind of on a narrow peninsula on the river. It was bought in 1946 by Gore Vidal, the writer who had some great parties there, no doubt, for about 20 years. And in '69, he sold it to an investment banker, Richard Jenrette, who still owns it to this day. And he puts up with the train that runs through these communities like every 3 hours, just full on, often blaring their horns as they approach the passing gates for different landings at different small communities where a narrow strip of shore is accessible right next to the tracks. The train comes, blasts through. There's the tracks running behind Kruger Island, which is no longer an island. This is just, in fact, Bard is visible in the background. So this is up Annandale and Hudson. This island was, or this landmass, was purchased by John Church Kruger, 1835. He was a lawyer and had some money and built a landscape there that built a kind of a romantic landscape based on a Thomas Cole painting. Right at the southern end of the island. The painting was Moonlight, 1835. He had Mayan stones brought to the site to create, sort of give more historical resonance to his romantic kind of ruin folly that he built next to his mansion there. These stones, incidentally, came to America through John Lloyd Stevens, who was a famous kind of archaeologist, adventurous traveler, who wrote an account called Incidents of Travel in the Yucatan in 1842. And some of his incidents made it to New York City, several boatloads of Mayan artifacts, which are mostly kind of stones, that were going to be in a museum that never happened. They went into a panorama on Manhattan Island, which burned soon after they were installed and destroyed most of the stones. But there was one shipment that hadn't arrived yet, and that shipment is the shipment that Kruger bought and put on his island. Which no images I've seen remain of how it looked, but you have to just imagine using this as your guide. But there are some pieces of those very stones in the American Museum of Natural History, which bought the stones after Kruger died in 1919 and put them on display, where they're somewhere in the museum, this crazy, wonderful labyrinth, this odyssey of interpretation, the Natural History Museum. Right, oh, he would know. Oh yeah, thank you, South American, of course. These are the stones that were on Kruger Island that are still on display, and these were, incidentally, no doubt seen when Robert Smithson went through this museum many times as a kid, and he later published a piece called Incidents of Mirror Travel in the Yucatan in 1969, a direct reference to the original excavator of these stones. As anybody who's been to Bard knows, some of the great cement plants across the river remain, some active, some in ruin. There's also a brick plant there with some dramatic remnants. This is another landscape of complexity and drama and romantic ruin. This is Alson, a plant started in the early 1900s by a German cement company. In fact, most of the cement production is still owned by German companies to this day, German or Scottish. Alson has some sheds. This is an active cement pier that extends out into the river at Cementon, aptly named community, which changed its name back to Smith's Landing recently, but it's been known as Cementon for a long time. Here's an artificial island just north of Cementon, and then Catskill, the peninsula where the river comes out. Catskill Creek flows out into the Hudson River. This is actually where we're going to land and continue the last part of our journey on foot, starting with Cedar Grove. This was Thomas Cole's house, though he never owned it. He paid rent here his whole life. He paid rent to the gentleman farmer that owned it. John Thompson. Cole started coming here in 1831, 32. He rented a room. John Thompson had 4 nieces living with him, one of whom, Maria, Cole married eventually. But he remained a tenant even then, as he had children, and they grew up in this house. He worked when he first came out in an outbuilding, which is no longer there, right across from the house. In that outbuilding, he painted much of his signature piece, the Course of Empire, which is 5 paintings that show the transition of landscape from the primal untouched through destruction and overdevelopment and back to ruin. We'll visit it a bit later. But this is where he painted it. And that was commissioned by Luman Reed, who was a great patron of the Hudson Valley School, a merchant who grew up in Coxsackie, just up the river from here. He finished Course of Empire in 1836. When a couple of years later, he moved into this barn that the owner of the farm, John Thompson, constructed. And while he was constructing it, Cole asked him if he could kind of have one end of it for a studio, which was fine. So his studio is in the far end. In fact, this building claims to be the first artist studio built as artist studio in America. So it's got that going for it. It's an interesting, it's basically a barn, but they've put back a lot of his original easels and furniture in the far. And he painted all kinds of landscapes, but he also painted, these kind of allegorical situations, religious notions, mythological notions, with people kind of in the landscape. And as he got older, he got more sort of moralistic and allegorical, which was less popular in general than his pure landscape paintings. And in fact, in at least one occasion, he painted a massive landscape canvas with an allegorical scene of people, some mythological story, which didn't sell, and he cut the side that had the people off and sold the rest as a landscape when he needed some money. But he was a hermit to some degree in the way he traveled and wandered through this Eden. This was his porch, the view from which looked immediately out to the Catskills, as indicated and named on the interpretive plaque that's there now. The house was occupied for those 2 years also by Frederick Church up in the attic. That little window was Church's bedroom for the 2 years that he and Cole worked together. After Cole died in the main house in 1848, the house was privately owned and is now operated as a museum. Frederick Church, though, after living in there, he became a well-known painter, but it took a little time. But it was a kind of a passing of the torch from Cole to Church. Church went with Cole to this hill near Hudson, across the river from Catskill, where he built his mansion, Alana, as an art star. In 1860, he first bought part of the land in 1860 and lived in this thing he called Cozy Cottage, kind of the base of the hill. Icebergs was another one of his big paintings, 1861. '61 was also when he began working on the building, the main house at Alana, the landscaping, which ended up consuming his work over time, being a primary sort of aspect of the landscape of his work. He created this lake to echo a bend in the Hudson River that was also visible from the top of the hill. More tents and function tents. You see There's a visitor center now there. It's operated as a kind of a historic site. But a lot of kind of became his artwork after a while. He painted a lot less and started really getting obsessed with creating land art, really. This blank wall, incidentally, was blank because the other side had his master's gallery of paintings in the dining room. From his porch, the view south from this part of the porch, you could see that artificial island and the cement plants in the distance there. The round portion, which projected out from his studio itself, had a kind of a sweeping view all across the Hudson from north to south, and in fact looked down across the Rip Van Winkle Bridge to Cole's house. This is life's work as he moved further from painting the sculpture of the ground itself. He described it as kind of carving out vistas that were like composed views. In a way, it was kind of like, why paint it? Landscape was fresh from the hand of God. There was no mediation. He cut himself, in a way, out of the picture, sort of, by creating these perspectival structures of pure landscape and composition. By making and sculpting roads and providing vistas on my land, I could make more and better landscapes in this way than by tampering with canvas and paint in the studio. And he owns it. One of the famous kind of viewpoints, Catskill Creek, near the town of Catskill itself. This was the view painted by Church and Cole and a few others. It's now property of a restaurant, which the owner plans on building into the Artist Ledge condominium complex, breaking ground next year, where you can have a balcony that looks out over the view that they painted up the creek. As you follow up the Catskill Creek today, it's a landscape of road. Quite often you forget that in order to see a place, you have to get there, and the roads follow the rivers all over America, and so you've got this river infrastructure, this road infrastructure that kind of drops down into the river and alters it. It's a very, very popular place to go in the park for recreation. Many of the falls are still there, but slightly altered. The most famous falls, the Catskill Falls, as like the sign says, you can read it for yourself, sort of a central component of the Hudson School. This was Cole's painting of it. There was a hotel at the top of the falls that, when he painted that, I guess it wasn't quite there yet, but it did get built shortly afterwards, and then was burned down in the 60s after being abandoned. This, again, the view from Cole's porch. This is looking out towards where the falls are and where the Catskill Mountain House used to be up on the hill, slightly to the right of the tallest mound there. Catskill Mountain House was the legendary resort built up in the Catskills, a place that Cole didn't visit that often. It was kind of more of a fancy place. He was, of course, interested in looking at the Catskills and not looking from them in a way. So this sort of place on the mountain, this sort of point of view looking back looking east was a different kind of place and wasn't really his cup of tea. But the Mountain House was a major attraction, one of several, but sort of the progenitor of a series of massive hotels up in the Catskills. There was a railway that was like a funicular, diagonal railway that went up the steep slope indicated on this map so that people would land at Catskill Landing, which I showed earlier, and they get on a train and go directly up to the Mountain House. This is Cole's painting of the Mountain House, which you can see on the left on the edge of the cliff. The house was built the same year that he took his journey up the Hudson in 1824. Oh, excuse me. That couldn't be correct. Never mind. It was abandoned. Oh, no, actually, it is. It was abandoned by 1963, and then it burned to the ground. There's another view of it by Cropsey. There's as it looked, and that's how it looks today. Still a place to go, but a place that is no more just a view, not a place. There's remnants of fragments that people collect from the house site. One of the last places, probably his last hike really, was, again, this is the view from his porch, but towards a different mountain. This is Overlook Mountain, which he hiked up on in 1847. His last hike. And you go through today, you go to a Tibetan monastery outside Woodstock and start walking from there about 2.5 miles up to Overlook Mountain. And the view is tremendous, looking down over the Hudson for a vast span of the river. But perhaps most remarkably at the site is the ruins of the Overlook Mountain House, another monstrous hotel now collapsed in fragments. The grand hall fireplace, tall concrete walls. Cole lamented the lack of ruins in the Hudson Valley, but if he'd come 100 years later, he would have found his share. The Overlook House ruins are evocative of his great allegorical work, which James Fenimore Cooper called one of the noblest works of art that has ever been wrought, and that's the Course of Empire, which starts with the savage state, as it's called, passes through the pastoral or Arcadian state. You can see Stonehenge on a hill. Consummation of empire. All of these are from the same general point of view. You see the same hill appear, reminiscent of the overlook of Catskill Mountain House, precipice in a way. This is the fully developed landscape, the peak of his vision. Destruction, which is in war. Finally, dissolution. I wonder where we are in this cycle, whether we're at the beginning or the middle or towards the end. Gazing eastward over the Hudson from Overlook Mountain with the sun setting behind us, looking towards the east and the future sunrise, and the Hudson represents, looking that way, a new era of the rising sun, or perhaps just another day tomorrow. Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, I can take questions if you have any questions. I know I do. The question, why Troy? Well, partially because of this centrality that I mentioned early on, the sort of 300 miles from everywhere in the Northeast. So it operates as a Northeast office for producing programming in this region. So it's just kind of convenient. But it also is on the Hudson. It's a town that was kind of skipped by the 20th century and is a sort of a relic of another time, a time when places were developed along rivers based on river industries. And it's a kind of a vestige, but is also a really compelling environment to be. And it's right at the dam, the first dam on the Hudson River, the first physical obstruction across the Hudson. So where the river is estuary up to that point, and then north of the dam, it becomes sort of network of canals and goes off to Canada and out across the Erie Canal. So it's a kind of a fulcrum, symbolic fulcrum too, between up and down. And but also we have friends at RPI, which help to make things possible up there, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. So it's a combination of things. Yeah. Sorry? Yes, there's a number of waterfalls that come down, the Post and Kill Creek, for example. Yeah, and a giant water wheel, the Burden wheel that used to be there, supposedly that became this sort of model for the Ferris wheel, because Ferris sort of studied this giant water wheel when he was at RPI or something. But anyhow, there's all kinds of. It was the center of America's iron industry. Troy, it was a place that invented actually the first practical use of the Bessemer steel process. When steel was just being sort of created, and then Pittsburgh and other places took over once steel got into production. Troy sort of began to wane at that point, and went through a number of mill eras with textiles and stuff in the region, but for the most part it's been half as big as it was for the past 100 years. Yeah. The research for this talk? Well, we were working on a book that's coming out in the spring about the Hudson River. So some of this was for that. We have an exhibit up in Troy at our space there, which is about the Hudson River as well, but less about the sort of connections to the Hudson River School, more about the sort of the physical edges of the river and the different kinds of landscapes that have formed, and the relationship between up and down, this sort of big city and the backcountry that the river kind of represents. But the research also for me was looking into into these sort of the points of view, going to Cole's house, for example. I hadn't done that before, and they now have an Hudson River School art walk or art tour, where you go start at Cole's house and you kind of do the journey up Catterskill Creek and over to Alana. But it's so it's now becoming kind of almost a performative, interpretive odyssey to go back. But this is going back to the original romanticists, and it's almost ignoring everything else around you. You've just got this sort of historic lens on, like blinders. You're not supposed to notice the contemporary context, which is informed by the Hudson School, but is perhaps more interesting even. I think in general things get more interesting the more complicated they get in a way. So it's the layers that have accumulated over the past 100 years since the demise of the school are really where the story about people lies, I think. Yeah.
I remember way back the Hudson River School was kind of where they stopped putting ruins in American paintings, and they kind of were able to accept it as an American landscape because they hadn't been historically.
Mhm.
Is that true? Do you find that that was true, or do you think it happened earlier, like with explorer art, or do you think it actually happened later? With modern ruins on its property?
Well, it was an established tradition of Romanticism to have ruins. You know, the European painters put ruins in their paintings too. But yeah, the Hudson School generally, yeah, they included ruins. I mean, you saw all the sort of Cole's moonlight painting and many others that include ruins. Oftentimes, though, those paintings are set and painted in European locations, even though they were done by Hudson River School American painters. For the most part, yeah, they are associated more with a kind of a pastoral drama that is of pure landscape without structures of any kind. Often with one or two people to provide scale, but they would include buildings occasionally. But for the most part, it was kind of pure. I don't think it was a kind of a principle that they had to not include buildings and ruins. It was just something that America at that time was more about, the Edenic, undeveloped land. That was the story they were telling, really. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there an art of kitsch back here from Constantine?
You be the judge of that. Certainly the Luminists were kind of over the top quite often. But like I say, this was the American with a capital A art, of where it sort of began. So Kincaid is, those logical sort of drawing from those same sort of tropes and maybe he's still stuck in that era. I don't know, but he certainly is, drawing on the same sources of interest that those paintings still have. But I think the Hudson School is a little more technically adept, and maybe even more financially adept. I don't know, but no, he's hard to beat though for that. Any other questions? Well, thanks so much for listening, and